In this video, I'm going to give a brief explanation and demonstration of a three-step sharpening method, which has a few significant differences from a burr-based sharpening approach. The three-step sharpening method, developed by Cliff Stamp, aims to sharpen a knife while trying to minimize burr formation instead of deliberately trying to achieve a burr along the whole length of the edge, and also separates the shaping of the edge bevel from setting the apex at a slightly higher angle using a micro bevel. One thing I will mention is that I don't recommend a three-step sharpening approach for a complete beginner to freehand sharpening. There's a little bit more of a skill set required for the shaping stage and for catching the edge bevel when it has reached a sufficient level of sharpness to go to the setting the apex stage, but before it forms a significant burr, that it just takes a little bit more skill and finesse than a burr-based approach. And so for a complete beginner to sharpening who's never sharpened freehand before, I strongly advise learning a burr-based sharpening approach first. And only once you can consistently achieve results with a burr-based sharpening approach would I advise starting to try to learn a three-step method. The three-step method has, I think, significant advantages over a burr-based approach, but it's just easier if you already have a baseline of how sharp a sharpened edge should be, so that you have a better idea of how sharp it should be at the end of this shaping stage before you try to move on to setting the apex. The primary advantages of a three-step sharpening approach are minimizing the amount of metal consumed by sharpening, since you avoid creating a large burr that you then have to subsequently cut off. You also then don't have to deal with the potential for a slightly malformed apex from the burr that had to be sheared off, because it's always possible to not shear off the burr perfectly. Additionally, the separation of the shaping from setting the apex with a slightly higher angle facilitates achieving highly polished apexes very quickly, because it allows you to skip grits. In essence, when you set the edge bevel at a single angle by shaping, demonstrating with my hands, when you go to use a higher angle to set the apex, you essentially cut off a few microns of blade height from the apex that was formed at the shaping stage. This means you get under a significant proportion of the scratch pattern that existed at that lower angle, which facilitates skipping grits in a way that is not practically very achievable with traditional sharpening methods. Another advantage of a three-step approach is that it allows you to optimize your abrasive choices at each step based on what you're trying to achieve. More specifically, at the shaping stage, you're not actually worried about achieving a high sharpness straight off of the stone. You're more concerned with cutting speed and with minimizing the amount of burr you form. Towards these goals, a very muddy water stone works very well, because it will have a very high cutting speed, and the slurry on top of the stone is plowed into by the apex as it crosses the stone on edge leading passes. And so that plowing into the slurry, which contains abrasive particles that's floating on top of the stone, slightly rounds over the apex. But this same mechanism also serves to minimize the extent of burr formation automatically without having to make any special effort to do so. So in a conventional sharpening method, this would be a problem, because in trying to set the final sharpness on this stone, you would have to try and figure out a way to get that final sharpness without having to make edge-leading strokes into a slurry. So that gets complicated. It can be done, but it's not easy. Conversely, in setting the apex, you would want a stone, for example here, a Spyderco fine ceramic bench stone. This is a stone that has, it's a solid stone that's not friable at all. So this type of stone is really good for setting an apex because there will be no slurry generated that rounds over the apex as you're making edge-leading passes into it. But these type of stones generally don't cut as quickly as water stones do. They also have the risk of loading and of burnishing, which can lead to stress fatigue, the apex by being bent back and forth against a solid abrasive, or creating a burr if you use a little too much pressure or make too many passes. So these types of solid non-friable abrasives excel at using a small number of passes to set an apex, but are slow and tricky to use for extended grinding. So in a three-step method, because you separate shaping the edge bevel from setting the apex, you can use abrasive types that are good for shaping at that stage, and then switch to an abrasive type that is good for setting an apex at that stage. The basic methodology for a three-step sharpening method is you start by the first of the three steps being to take the stone you're going to use to sharpen the knife, and you put the knife parallel against the stone very lightly and cut off the existing apex. So this will first of all remove, and when I say light I mean really light, like just barely touching the stone, like just make a few light passes like you're trying to saw the stone in half. This will remove the old apex, and with it any fatigued metal that was stressed from being used for cutting, bending back and forth at the microscopic scale and materials. And so this is a step you don't have to take when you use a burr-based sharpening method, because that old apex will be driven into the burr and cut off anyway. But with this approach, you should start by making a small flat on the edge, which removes the previous apex. The other thing that creating that flat does is if you have a strong directed light source, like for example this lamp, which is pretty bright as you can see, from a directed light source you will be able to see light reflecting off the apex once you create a flat on it. So if you take a knife that's had the apex cut off, which I'm actually going to do here, I don't know if the angle of light reflecting will let you see this from the camera angle, but I'll give it a shot. So I've cut off the previous apex on that, and now when I look at this under the lamp, I can see light reflecting off of the apex along the whole length of the edge, from the heel to the tip. Right? So seeing that light reflecting, I know that I've put a flat on the blade, and so when I go and start sharpening this, or shaping the edge bevel on the stone I'm going to get in a minute, I know that I've completed the shaping stage when I can examine the blade after it's been cleaned. After the shaping stage, when I can look at it under the directed overhead light and I can't see any light reflecting back at me from the edge along its whole length, then I know that essentially the edge at the shaping stage has been made thin enough that I can set an apex. As soon as it will no longer reflect light along its whole length, you're done at the shaping stage. Now, at this point, and I'm going to show you in this video, if you want to raise the level of polish because you're going for a more highly polished apex, you can switch to a finer water stone and continue raising the level of polish at the shaping stage to whatever grit you want. I mean, you can go... Practically speaking, though, I don't think, unless you are working on a straight razor, I don't see any practical utility to going above about a 4,000 grit, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 grit on a water stone. It's like, even if you're going for like a sushi knife kind of finish, like an equivalent of a 13,000 grit apex or 10,000 grit apex, once you have the edge bevel at the shaping stage at around 6,000 grit, it'll take the finest apex you can put on it with any solid abrasive. because the scratch pattern you're cutting under is so shallow that pretty much you can set an apex with at any grit once you reach that stage. So with waterstones, if you're starting with a 1000 grit waterstone, which is what I typically start with on edges that are only lightly blunted or worn and that don't have any visible nicks in the edge, you can go straight from a 1000 grit waterstone to a 4000 grit or a 6000 grit waterstone, and then after that you can just set an apex with any type of solid abrasive. Or, incidentally, I didn't mention earlier, you can also use a strop, but for reasons that I discuss in other videos, that strop should have a minimum, the compound on the strop should be a minimum of 10 or 12 micron diamond paste or 16 micron cubic boron nitride. And you should, again, unless you are actually sharpening a straight razor, you pretty much shouldn't go under 10 micron diamond paste on a strop. Look at the other videos I've made about the subject if you want to know why. Now, if I was dealing with an edge where I had to sharpen out significant, a very, very blunted edge that had quite a bit of wear and possibly some small visible nicks, I would go down to a 400 grit waterstone for that purpose, or something between 200 and 400. I have a 240 grit Sigma Power Select 2 waterstone that basically that thing cuts so fast that I could use it to set edge bevels, really. So that would be that thing is plenty coarse enough and plenty fast enough for sharpening out small nicks. But you know, on a standard basis, by the time I'm sharpening my knives, they're usually not so damaged that I have to go below 1000 grit. So essentially, it's based on how damaged the edge is before you start sharpening. Here I've got King 1000-4000 grit combination waterstone and a cheap rubber stone holder with an Atoma 140 grit diamond plate. This Atoma 140 is what I use for flattening all my waterstones. You can also use DMT extra coarse or DMT lapping plate, which is even coarser than their extra coarse. I happen now to have bought the Atoma anyway, and as I mentioned in another video, the scratch pattern left by an Atoma is much more consistent and even than the DMT plates. I believe there's much less irregularity in the abrasive particle size, so I prefer this. Unfortunately, they're not cheap, but if you get an Atoma 140 for flattening waterstones or DMT extra coarse, you can also use it for thinning out primary grinds on knives or for cutting new, changing edge bevel angles, reprofiling. So now what I'm going to do, normally I wouldn't do this here on my desk. I have a sink I use for this, but I'm going to take a pencil and I'm going to draw a grid pattern on the stone. Now, normally I see people draw vertical and cross lines and then diagonals, but it occurred to me that it would be more efficient to just make the whole grid pattern diagonal this way. So you just want to create a grid pattern across every part of the surface of the stone. Then you take the stone. This plate was already wet, but just make sure it's nice and wet, and you just scuff the stone on the diamond plate and switch sides frequently, because you're never going to put equal back the front pressure across both sides of across the stone, holding it from one side. And now you can see that that entire pencil grid pattern is gone from the stone, which tells me that the stone is now flat. Now, as I've mentioned before online, but not in video, I highly advocate, especially for a three-step sharpening method, flattening your waterstones immediately prior to use every time you use them. I don't care if it wastes more of the stone, it's worth it. It's not like king stones in particular are that expensive anyway. The major advantage you get from flattening the stone prior to each use, as opposed to say after each use, is that the stone starts with a decent layer of mud on it. And this slurry when you're using a three-step method helps the stone, helps burr minimization on the stone. Okay, I'm going to just move this a little closer to myself. I've got the cloth. I've turned on the overhead lamp, which I'm going to use to check when I have finished shaping the edge bevel. So I think I mentioned this already in a couple of my other videos, but I tend to work the ricasso a little bit extra when sharpening because I know that it's the part that I have the most trouble getting fully sharp. And I've also mentioned that I make full heel-to-toe passes because it's just easier. I find it easier to hold a consistent angle this way. If people who can learn to use short scrubbing back and forth passes have it easier because that's faster. I never could get good angle control that way though. So one thing you'll visually be able to tell is that you can actually see the mud coming up and over the edge while making passes on this stone. That's because it started off with a heavy slurry already built on top of it. So that mud or slurry that you see coming up and over the edge does a pretty good job of minimizing how much of a burr you can form. I mean, it's theoretically possible if you really deliberately tried, you can form a full-size burr by staying on one side exclusively until you have one. But if you're switching sides back and forth, that mud makes it very difficult to form a large enough burr that you can see and feel it by hand. The burr tends to stay so small that you can only detect it with a microscope, which is nice because then it becomes easier to deal with later. So, after an initial set of passes, well, that looks pretty close to done. A little bit more, just a bit more near the tip. Also, when you look at this and you realize that that took me less than 30 passes per side on a blade made out of hat 40, which is, you know, not a simple steel. It's got at least some level of wear resistance to it. That should tell you how much faster a king waterstone cuts if you perma-soak it and then flatten it immediately prior to use. Because there's people that think that king waterstones can't cut any even moderately carbide-rich steels, and that king waterstones can only be used on simple carbon steels. I think this video speaks for itself as a counter demonstration. So, yep. Now, if you're new to a three-step method and you want to have a way, I think I mentioned this already, but always make sure to wipe off the blade before you check under the light, because if you don't wipe it off very well, it's possible for dust, dirt, or mud from the stone to obscure whether or not it's still reflecting light from the apex. And I think you may be able to see, I don't know if you could see the light reflecting before, but there's definitely not light reflecting now. So now you can also double check to make sure that you're not imagining things by seeing that the edge will at least cleanly slice newsprint off the first stone. So we can see here that, I'll grab one more piece. Yep. So, checking that, put a little more water on that. I'm just going to make a couple of very light alternating passes here because I can feel, based on how it was behaving in the newsprint, that there's actually a very slight tiny burr there, which means I probably could have done it in a few or less passes than I did. So, this is not strictly speaking necessary at this stage, but I find there's no harm in making a couple of very light alternating edge leading only passes when you're finishing with the particular stone you're using to really minimize the burr before moving on to another stone. So, yeah, that's a lot better, right? And now you'll see, by the way, that it'll have no trouble push cutting with the grain off of the King 1K, though I don't think I've ever actually gotten this to push cut across the grain off of the King 1000. I probably could if I really tried. I might do that as a stupid sharpening trick video at some point, but it's not worth worrying about because it's not important now anyway. So at this stage, the edge bevel has been successfully shaped on this Spyderco Hat 40 Endura, which, by the way, you might notice the edge bevel, or the primary grind, looks a little rough. It's because I significantly thinned out the primary grind on a Norton Crystalon coarse, which took quite a fair bit of time, but was worth it for increasing the cutting performance of this knife. Anyway, after you finish shaping on the King 1000, this edge bevel is already fine enough to take fairly high grit apex, really. You could set the apex on this with, you could switch to using a Spyderco medium ceramic rod from a Sharpmaker, or both rods if you have a Sharpmaker kit, or a Spyderco medium ceramic bench stone. You could use, you could certainly use this, which is an Atoma 1200 grit diamond plate, or a DMT extra fine. You probably could also use a DMT extra fine, because even though its stated grit rating is 8000, it's not, I would rate the DMT extra fine as coarser than a Spyderco medium ceramic bench stone, in my experience, having used both fairly extensively. But, you know, and certainly this is, the 1000 grit edge bevel shape is perfectly adequate if you're going to a coarser apex. You're going to set the apex on something like a Norton India fine, which is about 320 grit, or a low grit diamond plate. You could certainly do that. Basically, there's no reason to go above the first waterstone for shaping the edge bevel, unless you want to use an apex finish that is fairly polished. If you want to use a fairly polished apex finish, you can very carefully burr minimize and get a very straight, even apex off of a King 1000 that will let you grit jump all the way up to a Spyderco fine ceramic rod, or a 16 micron cubic boron nitride on a leather bench drop, or a 10 or 12 micron diamond paste on leather bench drop. But it's actually a bit tricky because you're trying to get almost no burr on, like, not even a tiny microscopic one off of a 1000 grit stone. It's not entirely the easiest thing in the world. It can be done, but it's a bit of a challenge. So the easy way to get around that, instead of worrying about it, is just after the 1000 grit stone has been used to shape the edge bevel, and this would apply as well if you started with a 400 grit waterstone to sharpen out some visible nicks in the edge. You would just go 400 grit waterstone until similar results to this were achieved. Then you'd use the 1000 grit stone as a polishing stone to just raise the polish of the edge bevel. And again, you'd want to, you saw that I switch sides frequently. You want to, in 3-step sharpening, you don't want to sharpen for a long time on one side. So I switch every 20 passes or so. I switch sides back and forth because you're trying to avoid building up a burr. So frequently alternating sides helps avoid burr formation. Anyway, So you would go for the 400 grit stone to the 1000 grit stone, and on the 1000 grit stone, if you're trying to polish out the scratches from a 400 grit water stone, you're probably going to want to put at least 100 passes per side, maybe 150 to 100 to be safe, but 100 is probably enough. But 100 passes per side, broadly speaking, to sharpen out the scratch pattern from the 400 grit. And then you would go from the 1000 to whatever the higher grit that you wanted. In my case, I'm going to shortly be using the 4000 grit side of this, because anywhere between 4000 and 6000 grit water stone, or even 3000 grit really would work for this purpose, is very good for just making the burr so small microscopically, if it still exists at all, that it plays no influence on the quality of the apex you form afterwards. So it's basically, skill-wise, much easier to go 1000, 4000, set an apex, than to go 1000, set the same apex. So it purely, it takes a couple of minutes on the 4000 grit stone, but it really makes it dead easy. Again, assuming you have the basics of holding an angle and all that, which you should before you're trying to learn 3-step method sharpening anyway. So I'm going to go get the 4000 grit stone, and I'm going to flatten it before I bring it back here, because even though they're attached on the same stone, I don't flatten the 4000 until right before I'm going to use it, for the same reason I flatten the 1000 before I'm going to use it, so I have the mud on top of it. So I'll be right back with that, and then we can continue. So I've got my 4000 grit king. Now I've got it flattened and nice and muddy, so I'm just going to spend a little time here raising the polish of the edge bevel before I move to setting the apex. Once again, you can see that the slurry left over from flattening the stone does a very good job of minimizing the burr as it flows up and over the edge. Just clean that off before I start getting too much of this stuff on my hands. Needs a little water. I've mentioned in another video that I don't usually put sharpening notches in most of my knives, so I just spend a little extra time on the part of the edge immediately in front of the ricasso to make sure it gets fully sharpened and I don't develop a recurve. I also don't bother to angle off the corners of my sharpening stones. I know people say you're supposed to. I've never seen why. All it's ever done for me is make it annoying to get the area in front of the ricasso sharp. Might make a difference if you're using a different sharpening method than I do, but for what I do, I've never seen the utility of it. The 4000 grit on this king is not quite as easily, doesn't release slurry quite as easily as the 1K does. The 1K will continuously make a fair bit of slurry quite rapidly when I use it. This makes a little bit less. That's probably already enough, honestly, but I'll just do a little bit more. Particularly try and work the tip a bit more. Alright, I'm just going to give these a few alternating passes, edge leading only. Oh, incidentally, in general, I'm reluctant to make edge trailing passes on any sharpening medium except a strop with a coarse particulate abrasive, because it's much easier to form a burr with edge trailing strokes than edge leading. And since burr minimization is part of the goal, it sort of makes sense to try and avoid edge trailing strokes in as much as you can, because there's a bit of a tendency to form a burr with them. So I'm going to take a quick check now of the sharpness of this. Now, it doesn't really matter how sharp it is off of the waterstone, because you're going to be setting an apex at a slightly higher angle anyway. So you're going to be cutting under the apex that's currently there based on the shaping stage. I'm only really doing this for my own curiosity, but that's just about. That's push cutting newsprint across the grain at 90 degrees off of a 4000 grit king, which again, on Hap 40, there's people who think that these stones can't even sharpen Hap 40. So, but even if it wasn't able to push cut newsprint at 90 degrees across the grain off the 4000 grit stone, it wouldn't really matter per se. As long as it can slice newsprint and push cut it with the grain, and it'll be obvious which is which because one will be much easier to push cut than the other, then it's plenty, it's been shaped plenty to be able to go to the apex setting stage. Okay, I'm just going to go put this waterstone back in its perma-soaking tub, and then I will be back to set the apex. Okay, so now that I'm done shaping the edge bevel on this Endura Hap 40, I'm going to set the apex. As I mentioned previously, setting the apex on this knife could be done now with a variety of different abrasives. I'm probably going to use the Spyderco Fine ceramic bench stone, but you could also use strop. Again, as I said, minimum 10 or 12 micron diamond or 16 micron CBN, or you could use high-grade diamond plate. I believe there's some European companies that also make solid sintered ceramic bench stones that could be used for this purpose. So I'm just going to get that there, and I'm going to use a little bit of mineral oil on the stone because it's my view that any type of solid abrasive or non-friable abrasive should be used with lubrication, in this case mineral oil, actually in most cases mineral oil, because mineral oil is, or any type of oil, is really good for preventing the swarf generated of the metal coming off the knife from sticking to the abrasive. And Spyderco ceramic stones in particular are notorious for clogging very quickly if you don't lubricate them. So basically what you're going to want to do now at the setting, the apex stage, is you want to find the angle that you were using to shape the edge bevel, and you just want to raise the spine a little bit. Doesn't have to be a lot, just a little bit. And then using very light force, you're going to make some alternating edge leading strokes on the stone. Usually 5 or 10 alternating passes per side is plenty. This fine ceramic has always been a bit grabbier in surface texture than the fine rods on the Sharpmaker have. Yeah, I'm not entirely thrilled with that behavior out of this bench stone. I forgot that it did that because I haven't used it in probably a year or two. Nonetheless, okay, so now we'll do a quick little check on the push cutting sharpness, again across the grain. And as you can see, that just flies right through the newsprint across the grain like it's nothing. So that apex, testing it using the Carter 3-finger approach, look it up on YouTube, Murray Carter 3-finger test of sharpness. I don't recommend doing this unless you know how to be really careful, because you can cut yourself doing this if you don't have some finesse. Okay, so I can feel, based on that this needs a little bit more. It's not quite, the apex isn't quite fully formed. Little bit more testing here. Yeah, and I can feel that that's already in a different league than it was when I was testing before. That feels what I would expect from a Spyderco fine apex. Yeah, so incidentally, notwithstanding the supposed grit rating of this thing, the apex that's left by a Spyderco fine ceramic I would compare to at least a 6 or an 8,000 grit Waterstone. It will trivially push cut newsprint, as you saw, at 90 degrees across the grain, but it still has enough slicing aggression to have no trouble grabbing and slicing through folded over paper towel like it's nothing, right? Whereas often if you take an apex to too high a grit and the teeth get too small, you'll notice that it will slide off of folded over newsprint, folded over paper towel, which shows you that you've taken the apex to too refined a level of polish where it doesn't have enough slicing aggression to really be useful for anything except shaving. So there you go. That's a simple explanation and tutorial of a 3-step sharpening method. I think it's, for anyone who's got the basics of freehand sharpening mastered, I think that a 3-step approach is just sensible, in particular if you want to go for a relatively refined apex, because if you want to be able to push cut newsprint at 90 degrees across the grain, you're going to be able to get to that kind of a result extraordinarily faster using a 3-step approach than a burr-based sharpening method. On the other hand, if you are looking for a very coarse edge, the 3-step approach becomes it still retains its speed advantage over a burr-based approach, because once you can consistently catch the edge at the shaping stage when it will stop reflecting light but before it forms a burr, then you don't have to spend the time to form the burr and don't have to spend the time to remove the burr, and then you can skip straight to quickly setting an apex and you're good to go. It's also worth noting that it's entirely possible and practical to take one's knives and shape them on something like a 1000 grit king, or even on the 4000 grit king, and then store them that way between when you carry them, so that when you go to grab the knife, you can choose what apex finish you want to set at that moment based on what you're going to be doing with the knife right then. So I could keep this stored with a 4000 grit shaped edge bevel, and then if I knew I was going to be spending quite a long time doing, slicing cardboard for, let's say, hours, because if it was half an hour I'd still choose a higher grit finish, but if I was going to spend hours slicing cardboard between being able to do any touch-ups, I would just take that 4000 grit shaped edge bevel and put an apex finish on it from a Norton Fine India, and it would have a 320 grit apex, and I'd be good to go. One other advantage of this type of an approach, because you inherently in this approach use a micro bevel of some sort to set the apex, this approach suits keeping a knife touched up between uses very well, because I can use this knife for food prep for, say, half an hour or whatever, and then I can, at the end of the day, come and do 5 or 10 passes per side on this Spyderco Fine, whatever I use to set the apex, in this case Spyderco Fine ceramic stone, but normally what I use today is coarse particulate abrasive strops. And you can just, when the amount of damage that's been done to the edge is small, it's very easy to actually just touch up that damage out and restore the apex to very close to or exactly equal to the initial sharpness obtained just when you finish sharpening. So this kind of 3-step approach, which inherently uses a micro bevel to set the apex, also works to facilitate maintaining an apex for some time between sharpenings using touch-ups. Though I will note on the subject of touch-ups that successfully keeping a knife apex touched up for any period of time between uses depends on being able to do the touch-up once only a very small amount of damage has been incurred to the apex. So if I have to cut up a couple of cardboard boxes into strips, I can generally touch up that damage out and get something very close to the initial sharpness. But if I had to spend 4 hours slicing cardboard boxes, at that point the amount of damage or blunting that the apex has taken is such that I would be better off sharpening the knife from scratch to restore it to the initial sharpness rather than trying to spend an inordinate amount of time touching up the apex. It's critical to note that in any type of setting of the apex or touching up of the apex on a solid type abrasive like a ceramic non-friable stone, or a sintered ceramic I think they're technically called, or a diamond plate or an India stone or something of that sort, that you must use very, very, very low force both in setting the apex and in touching it up. This is because the edge bevel that you're touching up, the micro bevel, is microscopic in width. So it's a microscopic surface area, so the amount of force you use generates a much larger amount of pressure expressed over that very thin surface area, that very narrow surface area, than it would over the much wider edge bevel. So it's imperative to minimize the amount of plastic deformation that the apex experiences being bent back and forth, to use as little force as possible both when setting the apex and when touching it up. Other than that, I hope you found this tutorial on a 3-step sharpening method useful.